Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be falsely accused for a crime you did not commit? There's an organization called the Innocence Project, and their goal is to use advances in DNA technology to help exonerate wrongfully convicted prisoners. Since 1989, they have set 356 prisoners free who should never have been in jail in the first place. And the average sentence served by those men and women who were wrongfully in prison was 14 years. Just this week, a man named John Kunko was released from prison after DNA testing proving his innocence, and which led to the conviction of the real criminal. He spent 28 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. On the Innocence Project's website, it gives some of the most common reasons why they were wrongfully convicted. And the greatest reason was this: 70% of these cases involved eyewitness misidentification. So just imagine you've been charged with a crime you didn't commit, but officers inform you, I'm sorry, but multiple eyewitnesses have placed you at the scene. You were home alone that night. You have no way to prove that you didn't commit that crime, and now you're going to jail for absolutely no reason. You lose your career. You only get to see your family during visiting hours. And people in your life who were some of the closest to you now look at you with suspicion, or maybe even contempt, because they thought that they knew you, but since you've been convicted by law, they want to think the best, but it's hard for them to not wonder or have a doubt in their mind, maybe you really are guilty. 20 of the 356 exonerated by the Innocence Project were on death row before they were set free. One woman who wrongfully served 4 years in prison described what it's like to be falsely accused. She says this: when you're accused of a horrific act you didn't do, you inevitably experience shock, disorientation, and confusion. There's tension above your right eyebrow and below your right nostril that sometimes triggers both to twitch uncontrollably, making you self-conscious about looking people in the face. There's a pinpoint knot that spasms between your shoulder blades behind your heart, making it hard to sit still. There's pressure that squeezes your temples and tingles on the edges of your eyes, making it hard to concentrate. You sometimes feel dizzy, dazed, disoriented, forgetful, disconnected from your own body. You wake up drained, your whole body weighed down by a lethargy you can't shake off. You feel a sometimes dragging, sometimes crushing weight. You'll be tense from your ears to your lower abdomen, struggling to swallow, struggling to breathe. It is wrong, horrifying, devastating, emotionally, intellectually, viscerally. It is very lonely. And yet there are so many more of us out there than you know, holding our breath. Would you turn to Job 19, please? Job chapter 19. Job was an upright and blameless man. Yet after he lost his wealth and his health and his children in a terrible tragedy caused by Satan and allowed by God, his friends falsely accused him of deserving it. They said, basically, look, you must be guilty of some sin, Job. Otherwise, God would not be doing this to you or allowing this to happen to you. All throughout the book, Job tries to defend himself and his reputation to his friends. He tries to convince them, no, I'm not deserving of this. I'm not guilty, but they continue to press their point. His own friends don't believe him and look at him with suspicion. And on top of that, Job believes God has falsely accused him too. He's thinking, God must think I've done something wrong if he's plaguing me like this. But if I could only explain myself to God, if I could only have my day in court and show God that he's got the wrong guy. But at this point in the book, in Job 19, God hasn't responded to Job. So in his mind, he's being falsely accused from all directions, and he feels utterly alone. I want us to begin reading in verse 7. This is a lengthy reading, but I just want you to try to put yourself in Job's shoes. Sometimes we think of Job's suffering mainly as physical, and he lost these things, but he undergoes the tremendous emotional suffering of being falsely accused by the people he most cared about. Listen to what he says. Begin in verse 7. We'll go down through verse 22. Behold, I cry violence, but I get no answer. I shout for help, but there is no justice. This is God. God has walled up my way so that I cannot pass. And He, God, has put darkness on my paths. He has stripped my honor from me and removed the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. And He has uprooted my hope like a tree. He has also kindled His anger against me and considered me as His enemy. His troops come together and build up their way against me and camp around my tent. He has removed my brothers far from me, and my acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My relatives have failed, and my intimate friends have forgotten me. Those who live in my house and my maids consider me a stranger. I am a foreigner in their sight. I call to my servant, but he does not answer. I have to implore him with my mouth. My breath is offensive to my wife, and I am loathsome to my own brothers. Even young children despise me. I rise up, and they speak against me. All my associates abhor me, and those I love have turned against me. My bone clings to my skin and my flesh, and I have escaped only by the skin of my teeth. Pity me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does, and are not satisfied with my flesh? He's trying to just get some sympathy and some pity from his friends, but he doesn't. He gets accusations instead. And you can hear the desperation, the frustration, the exasperation, the loneliness, and hopelessness in his voice. It was the heart and voice of a man falsely accused for a crime he did not commit. Now, Job was not a sinless man. He was not trying to make the case that he had never sinned in his life. But he was a faithful man who served God to the best of his ability. Now let's turn our attention to Jesus, who actually was perfectly sinless, who was the very Son of God, and yet he was falsely accused. If Job, a man who wasn't perfectly sinless, could be so disturbed to his core about false accusation, think about how disturbing it would be for Jesus to be falsely accused, to have his character publicly slandered and defamed. Jesus was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Jesus was accused of being a blasphemer against God. He was accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan. He was accused of being a Samaritan who was possessed by a demon. He was accused of being born out of fornication, insinuating that his mother Mary cheated on Joseph, so that even Jesus' birth was sinful. He was accused of breaking God's Sabbath laws. He was accused of condoning sin simply because he ate in the presence of sinners and tax collectors. He was accused of planning to destroy the temple in Jerusalem and rebuild it in 3 days. He was accused of misleading the Jewish nation down the wrong path morally and forbidding them to pay taxes to Caesar. And since he claimed to be king, he was accused of being a political insurrectionist, inciting people to rebel against Rome. Now, at first, Jesus defended himself, and he explained the truth, that they were wrong about these things, they were mistaken about these things, even exposing the absurdity of the accusations. But once it reached the point of his trial, he was done defending himself. Turn to Matthew chapter 26, please. Matthew chapter 26. Jesus stands trial before the Sanhedrin council and the high priest Caiaphas. And listen to how this goes. Matthew 26, begin in verse 59. Matthew 26, verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward. And they said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said to him, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus kept silent." You know, it would be traumatizing enough to be falsely accused and wrongfully convicted by accident. But these men are trying to falsely convict Jesus on purpose, which is why he doesn't even bother defending himself anymore at this point. Oh yes, he'll still make statements about who he is and what he's coming to do, but he's done trying to defend his character because he knows it won't do any good. Imagine how helpless you would feel in that situation, where you are being falsely accused, and no matter how much evidence you present to the court to the contrary, nobody is listening and nobody cares because they all want to see you dead. They all want to see you punished. Go to Matthew 27 now, please. To Matthew 27, look in verse 12. Now he's standing before Pilate. And in verse 12, Matthew 27, verse 12, while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. It makes sense why Pilate would be amazed. It's probably because he knows if he were in Jesus' shoes, and people were falsely accusing him of a crime, well, he'd be laying out this elaborate defense about how none of this is true, and he'd be begging people to believe him, desperately crying out injustice and violence like Job did, but Jesus isn't doing any of that. Drop down to verse 16. Verse 16. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Now drop down to verse 21. The governor said to them, "Which of the 2 do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to him, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." Not only is this perfectly innocent man wrongfully convicted, but they exchange him for a man who was rightfully convicted. Jesus is now on death row for crimes he did not commit. And not just any death row, but the most humiliating, painful, excruciating death row there was. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst of criminals. And the fact that Jesus was crucified showed that he was accused of being worthy of a criminal's death. So he died, wrongfully convicted, hung up between 2 rightfully convicted criminals, one on his right and one on his left. The prophet Isaiah, in chapter 53, verse 7 and 12, he says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. He poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors." When it says he was oppressed, a major part of that oppression was Jesus bearing the burden and weight of injustice and false accusations. And he was numbered with the transgressors, or with the wicked. When people accused Jesus of being a wicked transgressor and crucified him between two other transgressors because of it. And here's the most amazing thing about all of this. When you listen to people describe what it's like to be falsely accused, when you read between the lines in what happened with Job in Job 19, and when you imagine it for yourself, there is one word that sums it all up perfectly, and that is helplessness. You feel utterly helpless because you can't help yourself. Doesn't matter how much evidence you give. You can't help yourself. You can't get yourself out of the situation. And nobody else seems to want to help you either. So you're just trapped and helpless. Yet, Jesus wasn't helpless at all. He could have called 12 legions of angels and wiped out every single one of those false accusers. He didn't have to put up with any of that. Yet he chose. He chose to, because he loved us and wanted us to be saved. He endured the false accusations and all the painful physical, mental, and emotional consequences that go along with that. The sinless Son of God allowed his character to be publicly defamed and slandered. He allowed himself to be counted by others as a wicked transgressor. And he allowed himself to be wrongfully convicted so that you and I, the rightfully convicted criminals, could go free. Let's reflect on this as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning.